think we're ready to start. Is that right, Mariana?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Well, let's make a start to World Access Day here, World Access to Higher Education Day, WAHED here in Europe. The theme of this worldwide Access to Higher Education Day is about access and success in higher education in the post-pandemic world. And we're very grateful and delighted to be supported in this endeavor by University World News. In fact, this is one of a series of conferences which have been delivered uniquely across 6 continents today. If you got up really early, you would have caught Australia, and then Asia, and then Africa. Now the sun has moved round on our whirring globe till it reaches Europe, and this is our contribution. Later today will be followed by contributions in North and then South America. The European event is led by NEON, that's the National Education Opportunities Network, a UK-based organisation which does what it says on the tin, looks to promote educational opportunities, particularly to widen participation in higher education. And we've a star-studded lineup of speakers today for whom I'm very grateful, representatives of the Austrian government and the European Students' Union, as well as from NEON itself, from the World Bank, from the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and from Dublin City University. So welcome everybody to this webinar. The suggestion is that you stay on mute throughout, and when the questions occur to you, please put them straight away in the chat box. I'll pick them up from the chat box and pose them to the speakers. What we'll do is we'll take our first 3 speakers, and then we have a question session for the 3 speakers on that panel, and then we take a break before we have 3 more speakers and questions for them. So please, if you stay on mute and put your questions in the chat box. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our first speaker, Roberta Marley-Bassett, who is the global lead for tertiary education and senior education specialist at the World Bank. She provides leadership and technical expertise for projects related to post-secondary education reform initiatives around the world. Roberta joined the World Bank in 2009. She was previously lecturer in higher education at the Centre for Higher Education Management and Policy at the University of Southampton in the UK. She has global experience, having worked extensively in the United States and in other countries, and so she is an ideal speaker to start off our session this morning. So over to you, Roberta.
Thank you so much, Les, and I hope I'm an ideal speaker. We'll see. I have a brief presentation because the work done and placed on the issues of equity in higher education in COVID to suit the content and the theme of this. We'll hope this works. Okay. Thank you all for joining today, and for especially to Graham for inviting me to participate in this event. So here it should go to slideshow in a second. I'll just tell you a little bit about the World Bank's work in tertiary education. The World Bank is the globe's largest donor to tertiary education initiatives and has been for the last several decades. Since 2015, we have about $10 billion worth of investments in tertiary education projects around the world, and about 50% of that are for tertiary education projects in sub-Saharan Africa. This slide shows actually the distribution of key objective areas in our tertiary education portfolio. And you can see out of the about 49 active projects we have in tertiary education around the world, about 30 have a specific focus on access and equity. Here, I just talk a bit about the World Bank's vision for tertiary education. For the individual, we are focused on issues such as employability, democratic participation, better health outcomes, and happiness. As we all know, that education levels are directly related to happiness, and we do genuinely care about that. To society, it's about human capital and long-term growth, the contributions of tertiary education to innovation and regional development, as well as social cohesion and well-functioning societies. And in the center, we talk about our vision, which is that tertiary education contributes to equitable growth, social cohesion, societies with strong civic foundations, and success and advance of individual students as well. But countries, institutions, and students may not reach their full potential for a whole slew of reasons, some of which we depict here, including issues of access and equity, funding, insufficient funding, or funding that is not directed strategically with an outcome orientation. Persistent issues around governance and quality assurance, these issues that are following now, you'll see even more in the COVID era, issues of outdated teaching modes, the insufficient focus on learning sciences and how students learn, and a focus on research outputs. Imbalanced systems, and this is something the bank is focusing quite a lot on in the next era of our investments into the tertiary sector, looking at more than just universities, looking at the college sector, the post-secondary TVET sector, and how we can use the sector more broadly to fit the needs of students and society. And then also these biases towards low-cost subjects. This is something that has been quite present in the COVID era as we're trying to figure out how to improve delivery in these pandemic closures and the sort of ripple effects of that around hybrid learning that are coming out now. The biases in the system towards the low-cost subjects are creating real challenges in the outcomes of graduates, and we have to work together, governments and donors alike, to figure out systems that are better suited to the present and future outcomes we hope to have from our sectors. And the COVID-19 crisis has shown that institutions and systems lack resilient strategies and planning and are unequally digitally prepared. And I know none of this is going to come as a surprise to any of you. So this is, again, part of the bank's strategy about making equity a priority. We see this as an issue for all stages of life, not just in access, but also in areas of study, as we know that there are horizontal and vertical challenges of equity in tertiary education, and the horizontal have to do with where students are able to study and what they're able to study. Issues of retention and labor market transition. So it's really the whole cycle of learning in the post-secondary space. And offering flexibility is really important as equity concerns rise, because students with stronger needs and are underrepresented or have bigger challenges in succeeding in tertiary education often need to enter and exit the system more frequently, more readily, and need to have multiple pathways to come back in and out. This also requires clear articulation mechanisms that allow for movement, say, within a community college to a university sector, or from a technical institution to a more traditional university. And systems that have this in place have stronger equity outcomes in the end. A focus on relevance, employability and skills, innovation and regional development. These are still important for equitable outcomes for students in particular. And then diversity, that we have diverse systems and diverse institutions so that students can find the place that best suits them in the tertiary system as a whole. So equity and access remain a challenge. This is the focus of this presentation and this day-long event about access. So I'm pivoting away from some of the other human capital orientations of the World Bank strategy on tertiary education. And I will focus here more on access and equity. So we see through the data that equity and access remain a big challenge globally. And also you see it especially by wealth distribution in the first quintiles versus the fifth quintile versus the first. So the highest earners and the highest wealth quintile versus the lowest. And this presents a very detailed mapping of the inequities and disparities that are seen globally. Just to focus on one region, particularly important to me personally, because I'm working on several projects in East Africa. The sub-Saharan African region has the worst current outcomes still in tertiary education enrollment, and that extends actually to progression and completion. You'll see that the average in 2018 for the sub-Saharan continent for access was about 9%. And for Europe and Central Asia as a comparator, it was about 70%. And so, you know, though improvements have been made, and you can see on this chart, the increased access as a percentage of the population is pretty steady across the globe. The growth is still quite low and a little too slow for what we would like to see for sub-Saharan Africa, which is then underpinning the increased investments that the World Bank is making in the region in tertiary education. So to put this in the COVID context, and many of you may have seen this, this was part of a paper that we published on the World Bank's website in April that just provided some just sheer numbers of the impact of the COVID closures. So we recognize that in many of these contexts, delivery went digital or otherwise remote, but for the most part, we've seen at least some form of impact, some form of challenge presented to about 220 million students around the world in the time of COVID. And the big challenge for us, and I'm sure for many of you, is that the return to campus will not be so easily calculable. It was easy for us, relatively easy, to look at the broad data and say, okay, whole systems have shut down. We know the number of students enrolled in those systems. We can extrapolate from that the impact to that country, to that region, to those income levels of those countries. The big challenge, and I've been asked this a lot recently, is, you know, who's doing it well now? How many have come back? What have the impacts been on the return to campuses? And that is actually going to be much harder for us to determine, because nobody is doing this in clear waves. The return to campus has been hit or miss in different contexts. Even in the wealthiest countries, some campuses chose to reopen very thoroughly, some haven't, some have gone to actually been published data thus far show who hasn't returned. Students not returning, about the impact of enrollments on community colleges and how the community colleges have not been able to recoup their enrollments. And this is for a number of reasons that I will get into in further slides. But the data for us to assess the reopening strategies and which countries, which contexts have done this well, still is very vague, and we will keep monitoring it to the point where there's some data, household surveys or otherwise, that allow us to really assess the impact. So I published a blog in June, I think, on 3 key equity areas that we were really focused on at the time and continue to focus on today, that students' lives, not just their academic programs, have been disrupted. And this, many of you will understand from your own context, that when students attend tertiary education, they move their whole lives there. They get jobs on campus or in the immediate environment. Their medical care is provided on campus or in the immediate environment. They move their families, they establish their lives. And when those campuses closed, especially for those students who relied on housing to be coming from their institutions, the disruption was very traumatic, and they had to reestablish lives elsewhere. And that has long equity repercussions that we're still monitoring and are going to be long lasting for many students. Persistence rates are likely to diminish, and those will be disproportionate for at-risk and underserved students and groups. And the digital divide has been exposed as one that impacts socioeconomic distribution as much as anything else. And we see this especially in our developing countries, the clients of the World Bank, where internet penetration can be as low as 30%. And those students who've gone home to those regions, to those towns where the internet penetration is just insufficient, have had to just stop studying. And this has been catastrophic for large portions of student groups and countries around the world. So here are some of the technology bottlenecks, and I know I'm running out of time, so I only have a couple slides left, that we are monitoring and that we are very aware of, and that we advise our clients to be very aware of as they seek huge investments now in technology as an answer to the COVID pandemic and the impacts of closures. We know for sure that technology is not the answer for all things, and we've encouraged our clients in particular to think about multiple modes of delivery because of the digital divide. And some of those modes include some very archaic delivery devices, such as printing out paper or using flash drives or CDs and the like, because of some of these technology bottlenecks. And these include inequality in connectivity, as I mentioned. Students and faculty often just don't have the connectivity when they've left the campus environment. Academic staff not being trained to deliver remote learning, to deliver online courses, and that there is a very specific pedagogy around online delivery that needs to be brought to the campuses, to the academic staff, to train them to do this well. And in a crisis, it's too late. Students' capacity to adapt has been extremely varied. Many, if not most, students were not experienced online learners, and when they've returned to their home environments to study, they faced challenges that led to dissatisfaction, disruption, and even disassociation from their academic experience. Learning from mistakes and recognizing them, being very analytical and self-reflective about the regulatory environment has to adapt very quickly, especially the quality assurance environments, but also issues like charters of institutions or degree mobility and transfer of credits, things like that. And then my last slide is something that we have been focusing on as we've spent so much time really working with our clients to adapt rapidly to new forms of delivery. It's about holding on to the core values of higher education, those things that we think are most important, because they get lost very easily in the scramble for tools and money and other forms of technology. The values are incredibly important. So here we use this quote from Scholars at Risk, saying higher education is an engine of knowledge production, discovery, innovation, etc. But to be healthy, higher education communities must be grounded in core values, including equitable access, accountability, academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and social responsibility. These are core values that the World Bank holds dear as well. And so I'll wrap my comments on this here.
Thank you very much indeed, Roberta, for getting us off to such an excellent start. Please put your questions in the chat box, because we are going to move on to our next speaker. But thank you so much for that, Roberta. And I should also have said at the beginning, please use your social media. The hashtag for the meeting is hashtag WAHED, WAHED 2020. And Martin has put that in the chat box for you if you didn't catch that. But we move on to our second speaker this morning, Joanna Newman. Joanna is the Chief Executive and Secretary General of the Association of Commonwealth Universities, a post that she has held since April 2017. She's responsible for fostering and promoting the aims of the ACU. Before her time at the ACU, she was Vice Principal International at King's College, University of London, or King's College London, I think I should say these days, where she was responsible for international matters for the university. She had a distinguished career in international education, and therefore very appropriate for us to ask her to speak in our little symposium this morning. Joanna.
Thank you very much, Les, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at World Access to Higher Education Day, which is central and core to what the Association of Commonwealth Universities believes in. We are a network of over 530 universities spread across 5 continents. 66% of our members are in low and middle income countries, but we also have a spread of the largest, the smallest, private and public universities, teaching only and teaching and research. If there is only one message to give during World Access to Higher Education Day, the message is that higher education is an essential component in the education ecostructure, and you cannot contribute or solve any one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals without the vital contribution that higher education makes, whether it is in early childhood research, whether it's in providing really good primary education, whether it's in training teachers, whether it's in producing content, whether it's in undergraduate teaching, whether it's instilling citizenship and curiosity into the next generation of citizens across the world, and whether it's into world-leading research, which we've seen in recent times, particularly during the search for a vaccine for COVID. You cannot do any of these things without universities. And the reason that I'm making that plea at World Access to Higher Education Day is that for too long now, and for many good reasons, most focus in development world has been on building primary and secondary. And our argument with the Association of Francophonie Universities and the International Association of Universities, the 3 networks are together as one at the UN every year to push this message that please spend on tertiary education, including further education, because you need to make sure that there is a bridge between school and college if you really want societies to be healthy, stable, and to be sustainable. So access to higher education matters more than ever and should be available to all those who would benefit. But of course, it still remains heavily dependent on wealth and geography. And I think Roberta showed some slides of the gross tertiary enrollment, which is globally 38%, which conceals a massive wide regional variation, 77% in Europe and North America, but only 9% across sub-Saharan African countries. And access to international education is also incredibly important for everybody, whether it's outward mobility or inward mobility. But again, this is something which is very much limited to those able to carry out international mobility. And the ACU is a champion of making it a much more even playing field. And we do that through the scholarship schemes that we run, but we also do it through the grants we give to our members for travel between the networks to different universities. And research has also demonstrably shown at all stages that the value of an international experience for students' academic performance and graduate earnings and intercultural agility is extremely beneficial. I think what COVID has shown us or exposed more than ever is the huge divide and inequalities that exist across the world in access to education, including higher education, not least a digital divide. And while some universities were able to embrace the evolution and use the opportunity to strengthen their digital learning curricula and made a massively quick transition to online and a very creative one, it did actually show across the Commonwealth context stark disparities in internet connectivity and infrastructure. So we surveyed our members and we found that there was not only a large digital divide. In other words, there were lots of universities that didn't have access to data infrastructure, let alone ability to access their campuses, which were closed, and or access even handheld devices because they didn't have an access to data. There are also divides within institutions. So, for example, the more senior levels of institutions, including the UK, there might have been perfectly good access. But if you went down to the student level or to very junior staff, access to relevant equipment was very, very poor and divided. So the survey that we did showed that there was a lot that could be done by governments working with industry partners, working with universities to provide better access the next time we need to go to a digital world. But I would also say that we've learned hugely from the necessity to move online. And there's huge creativity and innovation that has taken place. And we look forward to a future where we will be able to have the best of face-to-face and physical environments, but also learn from the time that we've spent since last March in the online space, and take the best of that and use it for creating better access, equitable access to education. The ACU is doing a project, for example, at the moment in East Africa with 20 universities, where we've created fantastic content for undergraduate students, which is where we train the trainers in those universities to teach that content both online and in physical environments. And it means that you can actually spread access much more quickly. And we want to use that model across our Commonwealth network. And in fact, most of our universities, particularly during this period of time, are now experimenting with virtual mobility programs. We ran a virtual summer school in Ghana this summer on the subject of migration and refugees, and it was very much a trial, but it worked really well. And we will be continuing to do virtual experiences, because we also think that these virtual experiences prepare students for a physical international interaction, but also include far more students in the initial stages of international activity than perhaps if it was a more traditional mobility program offered by a university as part of an undergraduate course. So there are huge opportunities, both with experimentation and creativity during this period of lockdown and this terrible period of illness and deprivation. But there are also necessities to look at this digital divide, look at how it's exposing far more concretely the divide between those who have and don't have access, and come up with really good solutions. I just want to give you a couple of examples. In the National University, the University of South Pacific, the Vice Chancellor has worked with shopping centres, so students can go there to get access to data where they can go and study during times where the campuses in different islands in the Pacific were closed. There was an example in Ghana where the university has worked with private providers to provide all students with access to data. There are lots of really good examples, and therefore one of the really positive messages, I think, to take to the United Nations next year as part of our tripartite mission is to say we can fix a digital divide and we can fix these issues. What we can't fix is the quality of education without the contribution of higher education to primary and secondary. And obviously the other more complicated factors that go into a divided world. But there are really good news, and I think that international networks such as the Association of Commonwealth Universities have a really important role to play in sharing our experiences and learning through our networks. We have a climate and resilience network. We have a peace and reconciliation network directly and explicitly addressing issues around decolonization and the legacies of empire, something really appropriate, I think, for an organization born through the modern Commonwealth. And we want to work with our diverse network to share best practice and to develop best practice in digital engagement, in virtual mobility, and crucially, in inclusion as we move to a post-COVID world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. That was really stimulating to hear about the things which are going on in so many different countries in the Commonwealth, and indeed your collaboration with other networks. I know that's generating questions, and please keep them coming in the chat box, and in a moment we will come to those. But before we do, we're going to hear from our third speaker in this session. It's now the afternoon, so I should say good afternoon to Graham Atherton. Graham, of course, as many of you will know, is the director of the National Education Opportunities Network. He led AIM Higher Work in London for some 6 years. He founded and now leads both Access, HE and NEON in the UK, as well as being a visiting professor in a number of global universities. Graham, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Laz. And is the sound okay though?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Laz. and thank you for chairing today, and thank you as well, Roberta and Joanna, for giving up your time to speak at our event today. As Les said at the beginning, we have our 6 events today, so I guess we're on event 4, so we're over halfway now. So it's all downhill now on to the end, I guess. And I think already and I think later on in my presentation, we'll try and pick on some themes that I'm seeing coming through the events today. I've been involved in not just one of the 6 events, but also not only that there's a range of other things happening that WAHED is connected to today. There are in individual countries, we have nearly 30 events going on that organisations are doing in their own context. And I was involved in one this morning looking in the Philippines, particularly focused on the role of Catholic higher education in the post-COVID context and looking at issues of access and success, as well as I was involved in the Asian edition of our 6 WAHED24 events today. And I'll come on to that a bit later on. But today, really, I want to speak a little bit about, in the end of the presentation, possibly WAHED and where that goes and what it can contribute, or we believe it can contribute, or hopefully can do so. And also a little bit about some research that we've undertaken for WAHED that will be released later this week in partnership with the Sutton Trust. Okay, so just to reiterate, I guess, firstly, what Joanna said in her talk, and also Roberta showed in her slides, inequality in access is a global problem. This is in the Access Map, which was a report that I actually wrote for Pearson 4 years ago. What we looked at the data available on access to education by social background across the world. We found that in 90% of the countries, i.e. all the countries where we had data, I think we couldn't find any for Greenland and a couple of other countries, we found there was evidence of inequality in access. So here we've got where we found no data. There's other forms of data that we found. We had index. We created an index for our report that brought together data from the World Bank and UNESCO and OECD, but also data on gender. Essentially, we found there was very few, and in no country across the world, we couldn't find data of inequality in access. And that's an important point to make, because it's been emphasised by Roberta and Joanna that in parts of the world where systems are developing, that we can see clear evidence of inequality, but also in Roberta's map that I think diagram she showed, if you looked at the right-hand side where you saw countries where overall gross enrollment ratios were higher, there is still inequality in access. You know, even you look at the countries that we hold up as exemplars of equality, let's take the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, etc. There's inequality in access to education recognised in the data they have. Not only that, as we see, even though we know that across the world, there are still parts of the world where participation rates in higher education are still very low, we do see that it is increasing over time. Yeah, as it increases over time, it's increasing more, if you like, for those in higher income groups. This is a table taken from another report that's been released today, an excellent piece of work released by our colleagues in UNESCO, in the International Institute of Latin American Caribbean Research, who are convening the final parts of our WAHED24 series. And they've released a very broad report looking at the data available on participation and access in higher education globally, as well as in the Latin America region. I would recommend that if this is an area you're interested in. Anyway, the slide shows that pretty straightforward that the percentage increase over the period amongst high income groups and upper middle income groups is more than in lower income groups. These are groups in terms of not just countries, but in terms of actually groups within countries. So we see that while it's increasing for those from low income groups within countries, it's increasing higher for those in upper middle income groups. Okay. So looking at the impacts of COVID, we undertook a survey of 45 countries where respondents who ranged from those working in policy making or university positions to try and understand to what extent and what the impact that COVID-19 was on access to higher education for those on low income and marginalised backgrounds, particularly what the responses of institutions and governments were here. Okay, the full report, I will be available later on. I've taken some snippets from the report. I guess the picture overall from the report is fairly mixed. I mean, this is one of the respondents from India, and this is the quote that she put in a response to the survey, saying that basically capacity-wise, the institutions that she was aware of in the countries didn't have the capacity, the means to support low-income and marginalised students in this transition to online learning. Which is again one of the huge challenges that's come up with both the initial speakers. Not that these can't be addressed, as Joanna pointed out, but certainly our respondent from India found that that wasn't really happening in their context, and it wasn't the capacity to do so. Of course, having said that there are things happening. You know, our respondent from Universitas Campinas in Brazil, there's the quote there showing that there were things universities were doing. So there's a multifaceted approach being taken there, adapting selection processes, adapting content. Very interesting there, particularly those in the UK content. You know, the higher education progression arrangements in Brazil are rather different, whereas one progresses to higher education for an examination the university sets. And they've adjusted the content in their university to reflect the learning loss and the impact on students when they pre-entry stage of COVID-19. Moving on, I mean, one of the other areas that we looked at specifically in the survey was that issue of financial support. The 45 countries, by the way, transcended all continents in the world and transcended those of different levels of system development and system history and overall levels of total income wealth for the country. We provide 60% of those responding were providing some financial support for focused out, including low-income students. Of the 21 countries in the OECD, only 2 were not providing any additional support that students could benefit from. So the majority of high-income countries were providing some form of support, not all of them. Particularly notably, I felt from the survey was that while, as one would expect, the ability to support students from low-income backgrounds through the impact of COVID, I usually via some form of either grants or possibly some relief on tuition fee payments, was it postponement of tuition fee payments or reduction of tuition fee payments, some form of relief. It differs across contexts, we'll see in the next slide. What's notable is that yes, it is related more in some ways to the income of the country, but not entirely. So you find some higher income countries who weren't providing support for their students due to the impact of COVID-19. Yet some lower income countries were. So if we noticeably, for instance, Indonesia, the Philippines and Colombia, 3 notable examples of countries where there had been efforts made to try and support low income students in quite innovative ways. So for instance, either trying to provide tuition fee subsidies and then trying to provide greater employment support. So for example, is Thailand, for instance, where Thailand provided actually tried to support their graduates. They're conscious of students going into the labour market and the challenges they'll face, and they try to put some support in place for graduates entering the labour market. So my point being that it isn't necessarily the case that you can do an exact map between a graph, if you like, between the income level of the country and their willingness or ability, or their willingness, particularly, I guess, willingness it is really, to try and provide some financial support for students as a result of COVID-19. Okay, the next table is taken from the report, and it actually just focuses a little bit on some of the high-income countries, and it just outlines some of the kind of support that's being provided for students as a result of COVID-19. So, Australia is quite an interesting example. I know in Australasia event this morning, and I believe it came up there, how actually what the Australian government did was, ask or compel universities to try and provide short courses for those people who weren't actually being reached generally by universities who risk of unemployment. Indeed, those as well also actually who are in higher income jobs who are at risk of unemployment, but a quite different approach to how things would go forward. As well as that, actually, in Australia, as well as financial support, they've also provided some focused consideration in terms of admission, trying to account for the impact of COVID-19 and the disruption in school studies and higher education admission. Canada stands out in some ways globally as a country where significant support has been provided for students via COVID-19, particularly a doubling of student grants for low-income students, particularly. France, again, some support, but less of that support. Germany as well. An example, again, in Netherlands of how relief on tuition fees, and then quite a large act, the CARES Act, provided in the United States. But again, at the same time as these actions being put in place, it was noticeable as well from some of the respondents saying that while these actions were important, it didn't mean that they were necessarily adequate to support all students. And I think the immediate impact during COVID-19 on the incomes and financial situations of students, I think it's been raised up by Roberta earlier, just show how many students actually go through their studies in fairly precarious financial situations. It only takes a relatively small disruption to that equilibrium to see many students actually fall in extreme financial hardship. Particular examples and respondents in the United States of students, literally being unable to eat, risking their housing, their healthcare, etc., literally being destitute. And this again is not in perhaps the system in the world with the most leading universities. Moving forward, again, this reiterates, I guess, it's the quote from a colleague in South Africa. I think it encapsulates well the thoughts about where we need to go forward in terms of addressing digital divides and moving beyond the concept again. I think the slide that Roberta put forward was an excellent one where it looks at different elements of this digital divide, but particularly focusing here from a respondent about not just access, but as well as the competence and skills, the ability to work in blended learning contexts. And I think this again opens up another fault line of inequality that is really crucial that when we move forward in terms of what equitable access means and how we prepare students for instance, for higher education in different backgrounds. We now have to think about how to prepare them, not just in terms of their core culture, their cultural capital, but financial capital, but also perhaps digital capital. There's a third area of capital we need to prepare students when they to have in their armory when they enter higher education. Okay, now let's turn our attention as I finish to WAHED. I mean, our WAHED24 series have 1,300 delegates registered from 107 countries, yet far fewer of those delegates have actually attended. Now, I guess, and these attendees, if you look at those delegates who registered, they range from global policymakers, university leaders, academics, those in a foundation charity, and a strong presence from students. What could be achieved? I think a question we ask in WAHED, why is community working together? I think our question really, I suppose, we ask ourselves in taking WAHED forward is how can COVID-19, how can we come through this terrible episode in global history? So many people losing their lives, so many people's lives being disrupted temporarily forever. How can we emerge from that though with some form of positive outcomes, as we've done through major global conflicts before, particularly in the area here we are part of the global inequality question. How can that happen? Now, in some ways, I guess, you look optimistic and think, well, yes, that things like WAHED today, the amount of global interest, the people actually wanted to come and dialogue about a specific event is promising. Because while many global organizations and many people have equity as part of their agendas, in many instances, it's how you make it specifically part of that global agenda when it comes to higher education. Because at the same time as there is possibly that moment for equity, there are also challenges. I share a couple of slides here. We see here that across countries, the financial impact of COVID-19 on higher education sector, education institutions is already and will continue to be very large. Already we see, we've tagged back to the United Kingdom here, to England, we see the potential, the estimates of the losses running into 4, 5, 6 billion pounds. And not only losses, for instance, here in the United Kingdom, the big impact here predicted to be is not just the loss of international students, but the impact on the pension funds of institutions of the downturn in global financial markets. So with the ramifications financially should push equity to the periphery of institutional concern. Again here, Canadian universities lose up to $3.4 billion due to COVID-19. All these are estimates. We don't know what the global impact's going to be economically, but we see those impacts already. And again, the moment for equity question is, how do we, I think, as a community that was in this room, this global room today, all of us here, because we believe strongly in what higher education should be about, that equity should be fundamental to it. How do we ensure that as part of that agenda going forward, equity is built into that, not inevitably put to periphery, not always by those who don't believe in it, but by necessity of possibly sustainability and financial survival. Okay, taking WAHED forward then, I think, you know, for us, where do we see the need for WAHED to contribute, or for the global dialogue on equity, if you like, which WAHED is part of to contribute? Research and data, we still do not know anywhere near enough about what differences look like across countries in terms of access and participation of social background, and what individual countries are doing, universities doing to address that. I would strongly recommend, if you haven't done so, looking at our equity map on our WAHED website, which brings together 70 information on the policies taken forward by 70 countries in terms of how equity stands in their policy frameworks. That will be updated, by the way, in the new year to undertake new work, the Age of Europe Foundation, looking at 50 more countries to find out exactly what is their commitment to access and equity in their national policy frameworks. Capacity building. Joanna's always brought today the excellent work that ACU doing to support and build the capacity of their members. I think there's a real huge role to play here in building the capacity of those to focus and address issues of access and equity. What does it mean to focus on particular groups of learners? What does it mean to support those learners? What are universities doing to support those particular groups of learners? What does intersectional form background mean as we combine both gender, ethnicity, rurality, socioeconomic group as forms of identity? What are the goals and targets for universities and governments? How do we continue to press for individual universities to have concrete targets regarding which students they admit and how those students perform when they enter? Because the reality will be the vast majority of universities do not have such targets now. How do we support micro changes in practice? By that, what do we mean in the pedagogical, in the research space across our sector? How do we support that ongoing daily change in practice, which makes equity and access part of that, integral to that teaching and learning and research agenda, the core business, if you like, of higher education? And finally, how to make equity part of the broader post-pandemic conversation, both within higher education and outside of that. I think one of the points to finish on that came through our earlier panels I've been part of today is the way in which COVID-19 has led people to want to speak and dialogue, groups who possibly didn't speak to each other before. In that ongoing dialogue, where does equity and access sit as part of that? And finally, I think on the point of values, I think it was really notable. I like to revert to his final point there regarding values, because I think values is a crucial element of our work going forward. I think that essentially it isn't just about who accesses higher education and how they succeed, but it's what sort of system they're entering. I mean, one thing that's come through the first 2 or 3 presentations today has been that issue of values. I'll finish at that point and then hand over to Les for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Graham. That was a really helpful roundup for us, and some very interesting research that will be shortly published, I know. Well, we have a number of questions, so I'm going to get straight into them, but don't hold back on putting more questions into the chat box as we go along. We have a question from Nick Rowland, which was echoed in some ways by Simone Hannebaum. Nick, thanks, Roberta, very much, but I was hoping that she could expand further on the note you made around bias towards lower fee subject areas. Did you mean these are generally the more versatile subjects to study in a hybrid format, and STEM subjects, for example, have been disrupted more? Simone also wants to comment on the, ask a question on the issue of STEM versus humanities, and she asks, are those low-cost courses in arts and humanities? How are we defining relevancy for higher education goals, courses that lead to innovation, especially in STEM and technology, or those that also contribute to civic engagement? And Simone points out that she's a historian by training, and therefore doesn't want to devalue the skills and knowledge and cultural capital of arts and humanities. There you are, Roberta.
Yeah.
Two civilizations still rub along.
Now, this is an excellent question, and I realize I breezed over this. So, you know, as mass enrollments have expanded globally, a lot of that expansion took place in low-cost subjects. And so I actually wouldn't include the arts and humanities in that, actually. I think arts and humanities are quite expensive to deliver and are incredibly important. So I'm going to set that question, the second half, aside. The low-cost subjects that we're talking about really are what were delivered initially through MOOCs and other type courses: business, finance, accounting, some of these sort of middle skill technical outcomes, you know, that would lead to immediate job relevance, right? And those actually expanded very rapidly, leading to a debatable but calculable oversupply of graduates in those fields. When the lockdown happened, so many of the enrollees were in those fields, and some of that is very easy to keep going. But those harder subjects to keep going, right, are the STEM fields, medical fields, even some TVET fields, this technical fields like electricians or accountants or veterinaries, you know, technicians, things like that, which require hands-on training. Those were getting disrupted at much higher levels than some of these low-cost fields. Ultimately, in the end, what we expect to see are a greater number of graduates in fields that have less utility in terms of both specific technical skills required by the labor market, but also sort of those broad, critical, analytical, you know, teamwork orientation, the soft skills that we value further and further in the labor market, which are provided by the arts and humanities. So the bank is thinking more along STEAM, not STEM. And many of you may be familiar with this sort of evolution of STEM into STEAM, which adds the arts into that calculus of skills that are really valuable, not just in employment, but in life. But the expansion of the sector has happened in a lot of low-cost fields, and those fields will overproduce graduates relative to fields that may be more useful long-term to the individual and to society and the economy. So yeah, I guess I glossed over that a bit, but I hope that helps.
That's very helpful, and it's stimulating further discussion, I see, in the chat. But can I perhaps ask Joanna to comment on a comment which was made about the advantages of higher education, and one of the suggestions was that we should recognise that access to higher education also promotes empathy as well as the other benefits which were stated, and perhaps while you're unmuted, Joanna, I could ask you, tell us a little bit more about this virtual summer school in Ghana. I think that would be a lot of interest to people, many of whom are planning virtual summer schools this year, and are really challenged about how to reach the most disadvantaged students. As usual, in this country, the middle classes are up for it, but actually to reach the parts that summer schools are intended to reach, how did they manage that in Ghana?
Okay, well, I'll start actually with your last point, which I think is really important, because one of the reasons that we think virtual mobility is going to be a really good idea is the same reason that virtual mobility was a really good idea before COVID, in that, to your remark about, although Erasmus is a program we hope the UK will continue to be a member of, and we don't know yet whether that will be the case or not, it is true that most outward mobility from the UK was to European countries and involved a language, and therefore was a very small, it was a much too small number of students who benefited from that. And the work that was done on a national outward mobility strategy has relevance not just for the UK, but for every country. And it found that there are lots and lots of reasons why students won't be able to study abroad. And that's about their own personal environment, their own family context. That might be about not wanting to leave a cohort of students. That might be about responsibilities. That might be about income. That might be about all sorts of things. And it's also about confidence, and actually getting students to work together on international hackathons or in ways that actually encourage international collaboration through, obviously one needs good internet connectivity, and that's another issue to be discussed, I think, around the digital divide, actually builds up a huge amount of confidence and those sorts of cultural skills that are necessary and that are part of spending time overseas. What we've also found, I think, for a longer period of time, so not COVID dependent, is that those universities that have been involved in virtual international mobility programs have found that many of those students then go on to wanting to actually spend some time overseas, because it builds up confidence. And therefore, there's also a necessity to not just have these longer term or year-long accredited programs, but things like summer schools or intensive weekends overseas are actually really valuable and make an impact in themselves, and are often much more inclusive than that term or year abroad. Now, we do a summer school every year, and it's highly competitive. Different universities compete, and they come up with a theme, and their academic staff curate it, and it's for about a week. And what's great is that we have from undergraduate to postgrads taking part in the summer schools. And last year, I think it was the Chinese University of Hong Kong on innovation in the humanities. This year, it was Ghana, and it was a decision we made probably in May. Rather than to cancel it, why not make it online? And that's a difficult thing to do, because what we didn't want was for the students who'd been selected to really have a sort of grueling Zoom style 8-hour sessions every day. We wanted to try and find a way to give them tasks to do together, to get them to have some sort of a flavor of being in the country with, and to feel the sort of cultural change that the Ghanaian staff and universities could offer to them. And I'm very, we'd be very open to share what we learned from it with any interested people on this at this conference. And what we learned a lot from it, and the students, we hope, will stay in touch with each other. We had a leading Ghanaian novelist talk about the issues in Ghana. We had students we spread it out a bit longer, and we had far more time off screen than on screen, where they would do problem solving and then come back together to discuss it. And we had sort of informal group chats. And so, just as I'd said earlier on, I'm hoping that post-COVID, we don't ignore everything that we've learned and go back to how it was. And I think someone in the chat said that that's partly what they're worried about. And I think there is an issue there. I hope that we learn from all the innovation that has happened, and that we make the most of that with an eye to equality, diversity and inclusion, and make sure that the learnings we've had from this period continue, so that we have a blended approach in the future.
That's excellent. I'm sure people will want to follow up with you on the learning from that virtual summer school. Graham, you mentioned about what could be achieved by communities working together. Pentecost has said that the pandemic and its impact on education is proving a lighthouse, steering academic centres to seize opportunities for cooperation across frontiers using online learning platforms. And he goes on himself to make an offer of cooperation on areas they have strong expertise in at UCLan Cyprus, I would think, on entrepreneurship in education. Are you seeing a lot of evidence of this kind of cooperation?
Thank you for doing that. Yes. I've got some examples, I think, of this kind of cooperation and collaboration in the work we're doing. I mean, I think in this year's WAHED, I think not just through today's events, but also through the research that we've undertaken, we mentioned earlier on, as well as early research we did through NEON earlier in the year, looking at admissions issues in higher education related to COVID. And as well as the individual events we see going through WAHED, we do see examples of new forms of collaboration emerging. But I think it's how we build upon them. I think, as Joanna pointed out before, I think that, and I pointed out early on in a different platform, that we talk a lot about online learning, we talk a lot about the new normal and online learning will be very common, etc. But you're also going to see a bounce back to the physical as well to some degree. You think about the instances here in the UK, the students who've entered higher education are now completely unable to leave their own halls and their own accommodations. Those students will be desperate to get back to what they believe normal learning when things are able to do so. And you've seen examples across, you have to look in education, see many examples when you see situations where there's extreme disruption, you then do see a bounce back to what the normal was before. And I think that also creates pressure in time. I mean, I think we also have to think when we talk about supporting students, we talk about access to success, that is facilitated by the academic workforce across countries and the pressure that those staff have been placed under by COVID to pivot their work online, to support their students, to gain, that face-to-face contact that they want to provide to students, not be able to do so. Pressures those staff have been under also mitigates against, collaboration, which takes time, which actually means, therefore, if you're going to have collaboration, you're going to have global dialogue, you need the facilitators of that. The organisations that Joanna leads, and also all that she mentioned, the organisation we've met already today, I've been on calls with a number of other global organisations which take forward collaboration across the education space. And of course, donors such as the bank as well need to be as active as they are in this. And we need to recognise the role of that facilitating bodies. It's important they continue to be important and have a role going forward if we're going to have global dialogue and collaboration. Things like that as well.
Thank you, Graham. I think we've got time for a quick question to Roberta from Professor Celio Emilio Arias. He asks, is the World Bank planning to privilege vulnerable groups, or will continue to focus only on advantaged groups in order to reduce inequalities and increase access to higher education? I think it's a critical question, asking whether the World Bank actually does what it says it intends to do.
Yes, this is not unusual, and I welcome the question. I think it's really important that those of us who work for the bank and believe in the work we do have a chance to interact with those who are very critical of the bank. So, our projects, and I will speak specifically to tertiary education because I've been doing it for about 12 years now, full time. I could spend a whole lecture on how the World Bank develops its projects, but the way that we look at equity and access is actually the bank pushes hardest on our clients to include considerations of access and equity in our projects. It may not be what the clients are specifically asking for. They may be asking for investments that improve their laboratory space or other, tertiary education, university structures that are more physical, tangible, and we necessitate focus on underrepresented groups and on issues. In the COVID case specifically, we're looking very strongly at gender because we know girls and women are being hit the hardest in our client countries by COVID and the exclusions that are being exacerbated by COVID. But we are the ones who often are the proponents of equity inclusion in our projects, and we do that as much as possible. The challenge for us is often that the World Bank works apolitically in very political spaces. And so what ends up happening as things are interpreted as the World Bank pushing a cause or pushing us supporting an initiative that really is government driven. And we work with our clients to do the best that we can, but given the realities of their political situations as well. So it's a complex geometry of engagements, but I can say for those of us who are education specialists, access and equity are actually the first order concern for us when we design our projects. It may not be so obvious outside, but that is exactly how we operate internally.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for answering a complex question so rapidly, because it brings us up to our break. Although the queues won't be as long as normally at a conference with about 100 people, we do want to be back in time for our restart at 12:50. But before I let you go, perhaps you would reach for your reaction button, if you can find it, and give, yes, that's right, begin to put those clapping hands in the boxes, because we've had a series of really excellent presentations this morning, and I look forward to resumption of our session at 12:50, where we have another 3 speakers. Thank you very much indeed to our speakers in this first session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Roberta. Thanks, Joanne. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.
Pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank you. Graham, if I may just say hi, and hi to Les. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're on with everybody, but it would be very nice, Graham, to just talk.
Well, welcome back everyone to the second part of our contribution to the WAHED24, access and success in higher education in the post-pandemic world, in association with University World News. So I'm delighted that we can start our session this afternoon with Martina Darminen. Martina is Human Rights and Solidarity Coordinator of the European Students' Union, currently serving as the Vice President of the European Students' Union. She's been an active member of local and international student movements for 6 years, whilst attaining her degrees at the University of Malta. And it's a real delight to have the student voice in our meeting today. Over to you, Martina.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and let me start by expressing my gratitude for the invitation and the chance to address you today. It's an honor to speak to you all on the topic and give the students' perspective on access and success in higher education in a post-pandemic world. I have prepared a presentation for this, and I believe I am able to share the screen. Yes. No. Where's it? There we go. So in my presentation, I'll just introduce a little bit about the European Students' Union, for those of you who may not be familiar with our organization. I'll then talk about the impact of COVID-19 on student life in Europe. That's based on a survey that we ran back in April. What has happened and what has changed for the social dimension of higher education, and what happens next. So a little bit about us. The European Students' Union is the umbrella organization for 46 national unions of students from 40 countries. And the aim of our organization is to represent and promote not only the educational interests of students, but also their social, economic, and cultural interests of around 20 million students in and around Europe towards all relevant decision-making bodies and stakeholders, whether we refer to those within the European Union, but also the Bologna Follow-up Group, the Council of Europe, and UNESCO. And for those of you who may not also be familiar with the way that we work, we divide our work in 4 main clusters, and that is the social dimension of higher education that I will be talking about today, where we talk about accessibility and student support services within higher education. But we also work on public responsibility, funding and governance of higher education, where we address topics of academic freedom, student participation, sustainability, and community engagement of higher education. We also have a cluster and a team that works on the quality and transparency of higher education, whether we refer to innovation, structural reforms, quality assurance, student-centered learning, especially within the digital transition. And the last cluster is the mobility and internationalization cluster that deals with everything related to European and global engagement of higher education. And the policies that we adopt within these clusters mandate our work and our lobby work and our advocacy work as an organization on the European level, but also on the national and institutional levels through our membership. As I mentioned earlier, in April, we ran a survey, a public survey to assess the impact of COVID-19 on student life. And we assessed 3 main areas. We assessed learning and teaching, we assessed student support services, and we assessed funding. And here I'm just going to highlight some of the most striking results from the survey. So the first one is that we have 40% of students reporting that they don't always have access to core study materials, and only 40% report that they always have a good internet connection. So that means 60% are having internet connection troubles while studying on an online learning environment. In fact, this has led to many students reporting to feel frustrated, anxious, and sometimes also bored in their academic activities since on-site classes have been cancelled. And another worrying trend is that students tend to report that they feel their academic performance has worsened since on-site classes were cancelled. And from these results, we draw out some policy recommendations. Particularly, we address these policy recommendations to public authorities and higher education institutions that they should support and provide a means, particularly public authorities need to put the step forward towards supporting and providing means to higher education institutions to improve initial and even continuing professional training for academic and administrative staff on how to effectively replace on-site learning and teaching methods with online delivery. And when we go on to assessing the student support services, again, we find only 1.5% of students would turn to institutional sources of support, such as administrative staff, to talk about the COVID-19 crisis, and only 5.8% of students would turn to them to address problems related to their studying issues. So this really highlights as an issue of trust and communication, that there is no bridge built between students and the administrative staff to talk about the most pressing issues that we are currently facing around the world. And in general, we've also had students reporting lower levels of general well-being, and this was particularly for those, of course, that do not have a supportive social network. And the recommendations that we really want to highlight here is that public authorities should have policies that enable higher education institutions to provide effective, accessible, and user-friendly counseling and guidance for students in order for them to find adequate solutions for academic, health, and even career challenges caused by this pandemic. On to funding, and here it gets more serious. There is just over 40% of students who have lost their jobs, some permanently and some temporarily. And for almost 10% of students, their scholarship payment has either been postponed, cancelled, or reduced. And for students paying tuition fees, the majority of students answered that in the survey, their tuition payments have remained the same at their institution. And I would like to draw here on results from another survey that was done by the Eurostudent survey. And this paints a picture to how dire the situation is for students in financially precarious situations, because we have about 60% of students who work along their studies, and it is mostly students who do not have a tertiary degree background within their families, who are also the most underrepresented group, in Euro student countries, that is around the European higher education area. What's worrying is that almost 50% of students would not be able to study at all if they did not have a paid job to finance their studies. And as you saw in the other survey, we're finding cases where students are losing their jobs. And when we look at other sources of financial support, national public student support funding accounts for just 1/10 of student income. Sources of income for students, they highly are reliant on their own employment to be able to sustain not only their tuition fees, but also accommodation and basic living costs. And from the Euro student survey, and I imagine this is not going to be improving whatsoever, but rather getting worse, there are 25% of students so far that report to be currently experiencing either serious or very, very, very serious financial difficulties. And what we would like to highlight here as a policy recommendation for all those of you who might be attending and might be working with public authorities or within higher education institutions themselves, we are really trying to push towards lobbying for an emergency fund for helping students to ameliorate the negative consequences that are caused by the COVID-19 pandemic for the losses of their jobs. And in order to see more shift towards the provision of grants, particularly for those coming from underrepresented, disadvantaged and vulnerable groups of students. We also want to see the system of tuition fees really to be reviewed and to adjust the policies, the strict policies on tuition fees. Given the circumstances that we are facing, we should be prolonging tuition fee payment due dates and introducing installment plans, decreasing the amount of tuition fees, and ESU's personal favorite of all, to cancel tuition fees once and for all, as higher education and education is in fact a public good and must be therefore publicly sustained. So in all this, it's important to keep in mind as well that the students that are losing their jobs in this are the ones coming from more vulnerable and disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. So it's having a further impact on increasing social division and inequalities and creating more of a bubble in higher education, making it more of a privilege rather than a right for students to be able to access higher education. I will move on now to another survey. I apologize, I come from a research background, as you know, and I always rely on this information in order to paint a clear picture. So what's on a more positive trend? I know that I spoke mainly on the negative side, but on a positive trend, when we've surveyed our national unions of students, to get a perspective of their perspective on the commitments that our ministers are making within the European higher education area to improve higher education, we see that there is a positive trend, that the social dimension is becoming more and more a priority for governments and for higher education institutions. In about two-thirds of the countries that participated in the survey, while only 10% of cases have not seen this prioritization yet. With that being said, there's a very long way from committing to prioritizing the social dimension and actually showing tangible strategies and measures. In fact, our NUSs, our National Unions of Students, report that only 6 out of 39 countries have national targets in place to enhance the participation of underrepresented groups in higher education, while another countries have targets but in place which are not being followed. So as you can see, there is this gap from the commitment phase onto the implementation phase. So what happens next from here? And here I would like to refer to the European higher education area, as it encompasses a lot more countries within our membership and within Europe. This Thursday, we will be having the ministerial conference, which gathers ministers for higher education and institutional leaders to make, who are going to be making very considerable commitments to improving not only inclusion, but also innovation and interconnectedness of higher education. And within the structure of the Bologna process that works on social dimension, we are very happy to be seeing that the ministerial conference will be adopting 10 principles and guidelines on the social dimension. These principles and guidelines are policy measures that aim to establish a strategic framework for higher education funding, which promotes the social dimension. And it goes on policy measures relating to data collection, to effective counseling and guidance, to mobility programs, to the role of community and civic engagement of higher education to get out of its bubble and really show the public why it is important that the public is supporting and funding students and supporting students and institutions. And apart from adopting these principles and guidelines, then we begin the uphill road to seeing their implementation. And it's important, and it's also positive to see commitments being made to peer support initiatives between public authorities and higher education institutions all around the EHEA for competency building. And we believe this is the best to reduce discrepancies in the level of policy development and implementation. I would also like to make one remark that is going to be a commitment also to be made and discussed on the floor in the ministerial conference on the European qualification passport for refugees, as recognition is one of the first and unfortunately the biggest barriers for people with migrant and refugee backgrounds who unfortunately may lack their academic qualifications, or their academic qualifications may be in different languages, and that provides barriers by higher education institutions in recognizing their qualification and of course their right to be able to access social mobility through higher education. And ESU will be working on basically in trying to enhance student participation within not only the decision-making processes, but also the monitoring processes that our ministers are going to be committing to this Thursday, in order to see the actual realization of these commitments, of these principles and guidelines. We also do a lot of work on capacity building with our membership, and also have provisions for project funding for grassroots initiatives through our Together Moving Forward program that provides local support to our unions and any people within society that wish to enhance inclusion of refugees and migrants, not only in higher education, but also in society. I hope that I gave you a brief overview and a clear overview of what you have been dealing with and what we hope to achieve in the next couple of months and in the next mandates. If you wish to follow us, please do so, and feel free to contact me at any time. And I would like to thank you once again for this opportunity to present in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martina. Thank you for such an excellent presentation and for keeping to time there. That has already generated a number of questions in the chat box. But if you've got more questions for Martina, please put them in the chat box, indeed, for any of our speakers. As we move on to Elmar Pickel. Elmar is the Director General of Higher Education in the Austrian Ministry of Education, Science and Research, a post that he's held since August 2013. Previously, he was the Deputy Director in the Directorate General of Higher Education. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you, Elmar, to give your presentation in our webinar.
Thank you very much. Welcome from Vienna. I hope the sound is good and you can hear and can see me fine. Thanks a lot. In Vienna, we experienced the first day of a harder lockdown due to the COVID crisis. So everybody of us works at home and try his or her best. So it is really an honor for having invited Austria to talk to you and to show, let's say, the Austrian experience and the Austrian approach. We were asked to talk about the general policy on the social dimension in higher education. So I will not talk about the special challenges we face with the COVID-19 crisis in the higher education system in Austria, but I can underline all the statistics, all the aspects you have mentioned already in your presentations. I think everybody of us works in the same direction and is faced with the same problems for the students, especially in the higher education systems. So I've prepared a presentation and I hope that I can show you now my presentation and you can see it as well. So I hope it works. I will talk about the national strategy on the social dimension of higher education as an Austrian approach. And it's really interesting and an honor to talk to you as a mixture of a very diverse audience of higher education leaders, higher education researchers, academics, students, since we tried to work on a very holistic strategy during the last 5-7 years. And I will use the next, let's say, 10 minutes to give some insights into the strategy. I will talk a bit about the strategy development process, then the very important aspect of everything working in the social dimension, the data aspects. I will show you the underrepresented groups and the groups with specific needs we try to support in Austria and try to work for. Then, of course, a bit about the target dimensions, the action lines, and some quantitative goals, and finally, what we try to do in the near future. Since it makes a very important difference whether you have a basically public funded higher education system or whether you have a higher education system with a dominant private funding activity. So I have to stress and to show you that the Austrian higher education system is a system which is deeply shaped by the state, by public universities, and therefore by public funding. So we have 22 public universities and 21 universities of applied sciences, but they are funded for 90% as well by state sources. So in a certain way, also public funded university institutions. And then we have about 16 really private universities. But if you show to the students enrolled, you see that, let's say, about 80% of students are in public universities, and in addition, then with the universities, with the students in universities of applied sciences, you see this the greatest part of the largest part of the students is enrolled in state-funded institutions, and that's important since it's a very intensive legitimation to have a state strategy working on the social dimension in higher education. When did we start? So the Bologna Ministerial Conference in Yerevan 2015 was a really, really important conference, since of course we were in London 2007, we were in Leuven 2009, but only Yerevan 2015 said directly that an effective way of doing all these efforts is through national access plans or strategies. So the national delegation came back from Yerevan, told the whole story to the minister, and the minister decided, let's do it. So we worked on a clear top-down initiative. The minister announced the strategy development, and then it was implemented through a bottom-up approach for, let's say, about 12, 14, 15 months. So stakeholders from all higher education sectors, from social partners, from the Austrian students' unions, from ministries, and so on, were invited to bring in their expertise in workshops and with written feedbacks. Very, very helpful was the situation that we have a very good data availability in Austria. So we could and can work with administrative data in connection with data from the student social survey. So that's the best basis for a quantitative strategy, or strategy with quantitative goals and evaluation. So this combination between administrative data on the one hand, concerning age, gender, formal education, study programs, and so on, with the data from the student social survey, with information like migrant background, family situation, state of health, alternative access routes, student supports, and so on, brought a real new large fundament and a big picture we could work with during the making of the strategy, and of course also ongoing over the years. To give you the examples for the underrepresented groups, we have emphasis in Austria, so students whose parents do not have a higher education qualification, men, women in specific fields of study, students with migrant backgrounds, students with a disability and or chronic illness, students from areas with lower entrance rates. And as far as the groups with specific needs are concerned, we work on the groups like students in employment. In Austria, we have 65%. I think that's a typical Central European or European issue. Students with care responsibilities, students with financial difficulties, and foreign students whose first language is not German. As far as the target dimensions are concerned, we divided them into three categories. So the first target dimension is to create and to reach more inclusive access through access information and orientation materials in terms of comprehensibility, completeness, accessibility in terms of the social dimension. The second target dimension means avoiding dropout and improving academic success through developing and working on testing ways to promote mobility that focus on the social dimension and guaranteed recognition of credits accumulated abroad, or the creation of an inclusive teaching and learning environment at the higher education institutions. And the third target dimension works on the creation of basic parameters and optimizing regulations of the higher education policy. And I will come later on it. We increased the budget for the student support scheme parallelly to these to the social dimension strategy in a very important way. We work also with quantitative goals, but I only show you some examples. So, for example, to increase the number of educationally disadvantaged students, or the promotion of gender balance, or for example, the raising numbers of received student grants, or a special problem, as maybe in many higher education systems, to promote the equal opportunity in the medicine studies. Now I come to, I think, a very important mechanism or instrument which might be of interest for you. In Austria, we negotiate every 3 years performance agreements with the public universities. And last time we changed for the first time the mechanism how to allocate the budget, and which is now based much more on indicators. We have basic and competitive indicators for 3 pillars: teaching, research, and infrastructure and strategic issues. But we could not find an indicator for the social dimension. But we could, and we did, we introduced a system of retaining budget. Retaining budget when the university doesn't implement measures or an institutional strategy for the social dimension. So 0.5% of the overall university budget, so approximately 45 million euros, will only be paid after the university has reported the successful implementation of projects, of milestones agreed in the performance agreements. So that's the way how we try to make sure that universities work on real social dimension related projects, milestones, and developments. Another example for a successful social dimension mainstreaming is the new development and funding plan for the universities of applied sciences. This sector is very important for the social dimension generally, and of course for the inclusion of disadvantaged groups. And the social dimension is included as a narrative in the planning document with different resulting mechanisms. To come to the funds for students, for the student support and the funds for student support, we increased the budget from 2016 up to 2018 by almost 40%. The average amount of funding was raised by 24%. So there are real improvements also for older students. So for example, the top-ups at the age of 24 and 27 for students who receive a maintenance grant. And also we worked for improvements for underrepresented groups in the mobility support. So there are further examples, as I mentioned here, for the implementation of the strategic aspects. Of course, dissemination and awareness raising is an ongoing process. So their national and international exchange and discussions are very important for the further development and the promotion of the topic. So there is nothing forever. We have to keep on working on the issue, on the social dimension, and on the measures. So there are networking conferences on the national level, annual networking conferences, and we participate, of course, in the European or international instruments like the European Student Social Survey, or of course in the international peer learning activities. As far as the monitoring and evaluation is concerned, we want to do an interim evaluation 2021 and the final evaluation 25. Since we have the Student Social Survey 2015 in a complete monitoring basis, we can use all the student social surveys, for example, that one of 19 and the further ones, as a good basis for evidence-based evaluation of all our activities. Thank you very much for your attention and for having listening the Austrian approach on the social dimension in higher education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Elmar, for a very interesting example of a national approach to the issues which are close to our hearts. And I'm sure that will generate a discussion when we come to our question session. Please continue to put those questions in the chat box, but I must move on without further ado to our third speaker in this session, Cathy McLaughlin, Head of Access Service at Dublin City University. She's been head of that service since 2018. It's the largest access service in the Republic of Ireland. She's held various roles in access service and community outreach, and therefore she is ideally placed to speak in our panel this afternoon. Cathy.
Thank you, Les. Can everybody hear me there? Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Les. It's great to be here, and it's a nice afternoon here in Dublin. So I've been asked to focus very much here on what's happening in Dublin City University. So I'm going to actually start sharing my screen here, and hopefully everybody can see it. Sorry, I just realized I've probably, sorry. I'm going to start that again. I need to share take a little box. Okay, here we go. And I have managed to close down my PowerPoint presentation, as these things happen when you're presenting publicly. So please bear with me for a moment and I will try that again. Yes, and here I have it now. So hopefully, yes, we're with us now. So apologies for that, folks. So just to say, as Les mentioned, we are based here in North Dublin. And I'm just going to play a little video for you to give you a little overview of, and hopefully everybody will be able to hear this.
Hi, Cathy. I'm sorry, I don't think anyone can hear it. Do you want me to share the video?
Okay, sorry, I will stop that then and just move on. There is no point focusing on something where the sound is not coming through. It's always, I suppose, an issue when you're presenting. Sound doesn't tend to be. I'll just give you a little overview of DCU. So we are the fastest growing university here in Dublin, in Ireland. We have 17,000 students. 27% of our students are made up of students from widening participation groups. So we're looking at socioeconomically disadvantaged, students with a disability, mature students, and students who are entering from further education routes. 92% of our graduates gain employment after 6 months, which is probably the highest rate of any university here in Dublin. And I think what's one of the unique points about our university is that 70% of students undertake a work placement as part of their degree or else study abroad. I particularly work in what we call an access service, which are students under the age of 23, coming from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, and I have 1,168 students on my programme as of today. Just to give you a little bit of context here, in Ireland, 64% of secondary school students transfer into higher education. incredibly high rate. But we know when we look at certainly lower socioeconomic groups, that rate falls to 26%. 1 in 3 of the Irish people in the population hold a higher level education, but in parts of North Dublin, which are within our catchment area, that rate falls to below 8%. So who do we target and who do we work with? We work with students who are from socioeconomically disadvantaged background, first generation students with no history of third level education in the family, students residing in North Dublin communities with really low progression rates, students experience what we call double disadvantage, disability and a socioeconomically disadvantage, and young people in the care of the state, members of the Irish travelling community, and those experience significant barriers to accessing further education, i.e. young carers. So we have a life cycle of engagement. So we start with primary schools where we are linked into over 45 primary schools within the North Dublin area. We have a programme of activity for what we call junior cycle students, which are students in secondary school education between the ages of 12 and 15. In Ireland, we're quite unique in what we have a transition year programme, which is around 16 years of age between our junior and our senior cycle. And we have a very active programme. We engage with about 1,000 students there. And then we have a senior cycle, which is a programme we call You First. It's a scholarship programme. It's a heavy based mentoring programme, and that's based on the campus. And then we have a very thorough support service when they come in. So it's about advancing educational outcomes for all students. So we really want to develop a positive attitude to higher education. We have moved to an online method of study. So we've moved to a very much online in the current sphere. We are working where schools are comfortable with us being on campus. We are going into schools, but we've moved a lot of our outreach activity online, and we've had a very positive uptake from communities and schools about engaging in outline work. So, and I think going back to the last point there, Elmer was talking about in terms of the key performance indicators, all access students in DCU, we have 10% quota on every single degree in our university. Unfortunately, we don't have a medicine degree, but that is built into our key performance indicators, and that is so our senior management is responsible for reporting to government, and our funding is based on that. So I get a lot of support, obviously, to meet those targets. And we reduced the academic requirements for entry into university for students who are coming through our access routes, and almost 70% of our access students enter on reduced academic requirements. So just give you a little trajectory of what's been happening with us. As you all know, Ireland went through a very bad period, 2010, 2012. And as you can see, as the economy began to grow, our student numbers began to rise significantly. So these are students who have come in onto the access program here in DCU. And you can see how it's been quite stable over the last 3 or 4 years. It had begun to tail down in the last year or two as our economy was really building up. I'm really pleased to say that has now lifted right back up again. And our first year student numbers on our access program has increased by 17% this year. And I think that's a reflection of the lower opportunities that Martina was talking about earlier. For students, there was just very little work. So students are now looking back towards third level. And thankfully, we've been able to meet a lot of the demand here in Ireland, because the government has increased the number of places within third level institutions, and there's been a strong encouragement to increase the number of places for students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, if you're going to take those students in, you really, really need to support them. And I think if there was one message I'd say to people today is, you need a whole suite of supports. It's not good enough to just take students in. You must make sure they get in and they thrive. So we have a 4-pronged model of using financial, academic, personal and professional supports. I have a team of post-entry support workers here who meet students on a regular basis. So I took in 330 students this year on our access program. Every single one of those students will have had a one-to-one meeting. Okay, it's via Zoom, with one of my post-entry officers, and we're now actually on round 2. And just, we have a triage model we use where we prioritize students based on their needs. So based on information students have given us as part of their entry route, and as part of the survey we undertake with them when they're starting with us, we put them into different levels of support that they may require. Students will move up and down through these levels of support. And I think it's really important. So students on high level supports get a complete wraparound service here, and very much a one-to-one and a support service. And we find it works. And I think that was a message I'd ask you to take away today. It's really important to support students on the first year of entry into third level education. Just to give a little overview, as I was listening to some of the speakers today, and we've probably been quite lucky here in Ireland. There was a minister for higher and further education appointed this summer. We never had a minister completely devoted to further and higher education before. It was always part of the education responsibility. We have been given large grants. There's been large grants given to third level institutions to purchase high ICT equipment, primarily laptops, to be given to financially disadvantaged students. This was done through a central procurement with government, and we took delivery of them just a week before the academic year started. So we have been able to give every one of our access students a brand new laptop, and alongside that, they doubled the student assistance, the financial assistance fund, which is the emergency fund that's available to universities. So the government doubled that for all the universities and higher education institutes in Ireland. So in addition to basically providing a laptop, we've also been able to give students finance to ensure that they can purchase broadband into the household, or if they need to purchase mobility mobile plans, that they've been able to do so. We've also been given a grant to access departments to be used to support student retention. And we have a good bit of discretion as to how we're going to use that fund. We can either get extra staff, hire in extra technology, whatever we need to do with it to basically focus on student retention. And there's been a large increase in financial assistance to support student mental health services. So again, increase our counselling and our supports for students. Our counselling services are open, and it's mainly via Zoom, and there's been quite a high take-up. Students seem to have adapted very well to that. Just moving on there. So I just want to flag this with you. Part of one of the things that I mentioned was our university is very big into work placements. But one of the things we identified was that students from more disadvantaged backgrounds were probably not getting access to the best internships. They hadn't got the self-confidence and the self-belief. So in 2019, we started a pilot program where we worked with large employers in the area to basically secure quality paid summer work placements for second year students on the Access program. We're hoping to widen that beyond the Access program to include students with disabilities and mature students in the future. Students are prepared using a series of work readiness modules provided by our career service to get ready to go out into this workplace. In 2019, we started with 50 placements in 39 leading companies, and it assisted students to gain, without the social capital and connections of their peers, to compete on a level playing field. Take us to March this year, we were in a really good place with this program. We had secured over 60 internships. We had 50 companies on board. And I think, as most of you can imagine, it all went a little bit haywire when we all went into lockdown in mid-March. So a lot of the placements were cancelled. Companies said they didn't know how to undertake virtual intake placements. And really they cancelled because they didn't know how to take it forward. So in response to that, we have secured funding to undertake research on navigating virtual internships and providing an evidence-based toolkit. It's going to be undertaken by Professor David Collins here in DCU, who is an expert and a research in this area. And the final project output will be freely available as a virtual internship toolkit for companies, and we'll be making it freely available. And the aim is to level the playing field. support virtual internships for 2021, and bring new knowledge to this under-researched area. So by the end of it, we will have a virtual internship available for companies and for students as to how they might undertake this. And just to give you a little overview, our access students excel in DCU. 93% complete their studies, 53% go on to higher master's level of education, not immediately after finishing their study, but within possibly 10 years of graduating. 96% seeking higher employment find it, and 97% of graduates achieved a higher honours degree in 2020, and I think it was 83% achieved a first class or a higher second class grade 1 honours degree here in 2020, which is something we're very, very proud of. So thank you very much for listening to me. Anybody wants to contact me directly, there's my email, or they're very welcome here to follow us on Twitter. So thank you very much for giving me the platform here today to talk about our programme.
Thank you, Kathy, for presenting the work at DCU and for giving us an insight into what's happening there in Ireland and the successes of your programme. Now, we have a goodly time now available for questions. They've been coming into the chat box, and Martina, you've been responding to some of them, but I think there was a general shock at the low percentage of students who were seeking support from universities. Nancy, I think, put that in the chat box. Why do you think that's so low, and what can universities do? We've got an audience of people here who are employed to give that kind of support. What can they do to build up more trust with students?
Thank you for the question. I hear now. Okay, that's fine. Thank you for this question, Nancy. In the survey, we didn't go too much in depth into this, but when the pandemic was first on its first wave and lockdowns were creeping up, we established a platform with our member unions in order to understand the situation and the situation that they are also facing with their students. And one of the things that they were doing mainly was awareness campaigns, because many students didn't even know of counseling services and facilities on campus themselves that they could approach. Students, and even sometimes the people there did not really understand the situation that was going on and the impact that this would have on students, because they were also waiting for more instructions from those above them. So that was the initial situation that we were facing in the beginning, but also there were facilities that in fact closed down because of the lockdown, and they did not have enough resources to sufficiently shift their counseling services online. And there are also a tendency in world countries that do not have that public authorities do not put so much funding or resources into such services and facilities. In general, students don't find these, then the little that they find, they don't find it effective or approachable in that regard. So what we're doing is really trying to push on the taboo subject of counseling and mental health issues as well, and begin to learn from good practices. Ireland is one of them, and our NUS from Ireland and the UK are the ones that also facilitate capacity building within our organizations, because we know there's such a well-established network of counseling services and accessible counseling services there.
Thank you very much indeed, Martina. Elmer, I think we're very much impressed by the data-based approach that you've been taking to your initiatives in Austria. And I must also say I was very impressed by the long-term targets you're prepared to tolerate, in contrast to the expectations of instant change in some countries. But I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about the challenges that the COVID epidemic has presented to the targets which you've established. Are you going to vary them because of the outbreak? Do you think they can still be achieved? And a very minor question, one of curiosity, why the cutoff at the age 27 for maintenance grants? Just because I'm engaged.
Thank you for the question. I couldn't hear it in the end. Maybe you could repeat it.
Why the cutoff at 27 for maintenance grants? I only asked that because I'm 28.
Okay, so maybe I start with the aspect how does this COVID-19 crisis complicate our strategy targets? We have we tried to support the students in basically in two ways. We defined the semester, the summer semester, as a neutral semester, so that concerning the student support. So the students with student support can study one semester longer and get one semester longer the student support. So that's the idea behind the neutral semester. We have seen the problem, especially for students which have part-time jobs in restaurants, cafes, in the tourism, and so on. But they are not primary receiver of student supports. But a lot of students in Austria work and study parallelly without being supported by the student support fund. And for these cases, we cannot do anything. So that's a matter of fact, since the crisis happens everywhere, and many groups of the society are faced with. But what we have seen is that the studying activity in Austria is increasing. That might be also an explanation for some phenomena Martina has shown. So the studying activities are increasing, and the exams which are passed are increasing. And so, I mean, there are also some positive aspects of the crisis. Of course, not on the social dimension, but as far as the positive development of studies are concerned.
Thank you. And the 27 age 27 limit.
Okay, so that's a special definition, let's say, since that's about the quantitative target, isn't it? No, I lost actually the point.
You have a maintenance grant for students aged 23 to 27. I wondered why the cutoff at 27.
Okay. I guess that we have simply defined main basic groups, and we used data and evidences for the definition. So there are, I think, pragmatic aspects behind. Okay. Maybe it could be 28 as well, or 29. So we said 27. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Elmer. Kathy, a lot of interest in you being able to continue outreach activity in schools. I'm sure there'll be some people who are sitting there saying, how is it in Ireland Kathy's able to get back into schools and we are not? Is there a difference, Laura asks, in the type of activity that schools are willing to engage in since the pandemic? And how does that interact with the fact that some of the pupils may have missed out on a fair amount of education in the past year?
Yes, I suppose, for us, like a lot of Europe, our schools closed in March and didn't reopen till September. And I suppose while incidents of COVID began to rise, they kept quite strict restrictions around Dublin. And our level is actually quite low at the moment. We are in a national lockdown, but our incident rate is really quite low nationally. I think we're probably one of the lowest in Europe at the moment. So what we're finding is that schools are no longer able to do a lot of their other activities. So they're not able to do their trips. So they don't go to the museum, or they don't go to all that hands-on experiential work they do. So I suppose a lot of the school day can be quite monotonous and boring. So if they can bring in an outside person, then they're very interested. So our staff take great care and follow the rules and the protocols as set by the schools, and we take our lead very much from the schools. Now, we are challenged, there is no doubt about it, because we've had to move a lot of our material online. So I'm restrained by my own staff, the number of my staff. You know, we were never employed as digital creators or that, so we're challenged ourselves in our own learning. But I suppose we're working together with schools to overcome it, and there is a goodwill and a consensus, I think, to work together to overcome it.
And a lot of interest too in your pilot on quality virtual internships, the evidence-based toolkit, and how you've done that.
Well, we're at the starting stage. We've just secured funding, external funding, to employ someone, a researcher, to do that for us, and we will be working with, as I mentioned, a professor in our business school who's going to lead it for us. I suppose when we went out, we had this problem because all our internships were cancelled. And when we went looking for information on, well, how can we, you know, work with companies and encourage companies to take internships virtually, we found there was nothing out there. So we realized we're going to have to go and do it ourselves. So that's where we are at the moment. We're just at that process of putting the shape on our research and working out that we will be working with companies and we'll be working with resources internally. And we hope to develop a toolkit that will encourage employers, because we think this is going to be the way for the future. But we also think it will really encourage access and diversity, because it means for people who are constrained for geographic reasons and often can't take up internships because they live in a more remote area, and while all our internships are paid, they are at the lower wage level, so people maybe not can afford to work in the city. So this may be and open up internship opportunities to students from lower income backgrounds who may be able to take their placement while they still live at home.
With such a high percentage of people working from home now, maybe these internships will be even more relevant to the world of work.
Yeah, and one of the things we're actually looking at is we're recognizing too that often people who are living in very disadvantaged situations, their home environment might not be great for doing a virtual internship. So one of the things we're just starting discussions within the university is creating a virtual working hub within the university for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who maybe their home situation is not conducive to them being able to undertake a virtual internship, maybe because they're working in large families, they don't have private space in which to do work. So we're just at the early discussion. So we're being quite ambitious in terms of what we're going to be looking for from the university.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Martina's a question for you about whether you're planning to make any comparisons. You've collected a lot of data. Are you planning to make any comparisons with other educational systems, for example, in Latin America?
Yes, one of the areas that we're doing this in is on recognition. There is the Global Recognition Convention that seeks to harmonize recognition processes around the world. And in general, the European higher education area has very well established already recognition processes within Europe, but it also provides sort of a level playing field for outside of Europe in order to create more harmonization and recognition processes, and thus being able to possibly enhance not only accessibility of our education, but also mobility opportunities and easier and more flexible approaches within recognition processes. And in this regard, we've been over the past year working to establish a global students forum, because after ESO, we did not find that there was a representative, an official and legal representative for students at the global level towards the United Nations, and especially on this topic, it's really important. So over the past year, we've been having meetings with other regional student organizations that also serve as umbrella organizations. There's the All African Students Union, OCLAI, that's the Latin American and Caribbean Student Network. There's the Commonwealth Students Association, the Canadian Federation of Students. We're all, we've had multiple discussions and sought out funding to build the structure. It has now starting its infancy of creation, and one of the first things that we're doing is building a report and sending out a survey towards all our students in order to understand better the vision of students for this Global Recognition Convention.
Thank you very much indeed, Martina. Elma, there is a question from Professor Arias to you about validation, certification, accreditation, recognition of prior learning. Are you considering an approach to that in Austria?
Yes, thank you for this question. We have not yet a real culture in the recognition of prior learning at the tertiary level, and only a very simple regulation in the law, and that's not really giving incentives. So we are just working on the real law reform to create a better regulation framework and better incentives to go this way. And we are, and the universities are working on best practice examples for special applications in certain disciplines to start with. So it's a real challenge for the Austrian higher education system to go this way. On the political level, we are very interested and we intensively support this development, but it just has to be done.
Thank you. If I could squeeze into you, Elma, one last question. In your data-rich environment in Austria, you will, I'm sure, have some figures on who is not achieving to their full potential. So you talked about the need to create an inclusive learning environment. In England, we know that Black students are disadvantaged in terms of underachieving in their tertiary studies. Is the underachievement at an ethnic level, or is it on socioeconomic class? Do you have any data that backs up your program of developing an inclusive teaching environment?
Basically, we have an inclusive higher education system. So it's not so problematic as far as the inclusion, as the access to the higher education system is concerned. It's rather the question of dropout. So we have especially to work on to keep certain target groups in and to accompany them in order to create graduates. Yeah. So we have two main fields to work with. One aspect is rather in the field of the social economic background. Yes, we have. And the second point is, of course, we have a society with a rather huge percentage of people with a migrant background. So we have to work on this issue as well. So if you ask me where are they challenged, I would say these both fields are the most important challenges we have to work on.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And thank you again to all of our speakers in this session. I think you know now to reach for your buttons if you would like to thank them with a clapping hand sign. I think that would be entirely appropriate because we've had an excellent session, and it solely now remains for me to thank them again, to thank University World News for their support, to thank colleagues at NEON for all the work that they've been doing in supporting this. For me to give you something of a summary, I think once again we have seen the importance of equity in systems, higher education systems around the world, how many of the challenges that we see in our own countries are replicated in other countries, and how COVID has exacerbated the challenge to get equity. We've seen how COVID has increased the digital divide and the problems that those from poorer backgrounds have in accessing higher education. We've seen the social challenges which have been exacerbated by COVID-19, and we've seen that the challenges aren't just about getting in access to higher education, but also about getting on success in higher education. And indeed, Kathy has hinted that they reflect too on future employment prospects. But we've seen some encouragements as well. We've seen increasing levels of cooperation and a willingness to people to cooperate on common challenges and to work together. We've heard about some innovative uses of technology to overcome some of those barriers. And I hope too that underlying all of this is a determination to come out better than we came into this crisis. A few days ago in Europe, we commemorated the armistice which brought an end to the slaughter of the First World War. And when we look back on the two wars which in the last century which so devastated Europe, we recognize that after one of them, we didn't try to build back better than the first. And after the First World War, we went into significant economic decline. After the Second World War, there was a determination to build a better society. Let's hope that after COVID, we have that determination that we are going to build better. We're going to build equity into our higher education system, equity of access, equity of success, equity of outcome, so that where you're born, where you come from, the color of your skin, what your parents did shouldn't affect your chances in life. Thank you to all of our contributors and have a good afternoon. And don't forget, you want to follow up, North America and Latin America are yet to come online. Thank you.
Thank you very much.